anything, Jason. I should have just had this slide come up and say I read your mind as to what you were going to ask here. This is just a suggestion, but communities that start around the same time as you, this generally is a really good suggestion on timing, but it's just a suggestion. There's no reason why you have to do it this way. You could be slower or quicker, or make any changes you want. It's really up to the CPC in terms of how quickly you want to move along and what you want to do. But a good idea would be to spend, fall and winter, doing your CPA plan, holding your public hearing, preparing application materials. You're going to need an actual application for folks to apply, and we have great samples of those on the website as well. And you're going to need to submit an FY23 CPA budget to spring town meeting this coming spring. So those things, will take some time. And so over the next, end of fall, winter, early spring, that seems like a good time frame to be working on all these things. Then you'd present your budget to town meeting in the spring, and your town meeting, I think I heard, was in May or June. Is it May?
May.
May, yes. Okay,
May.
Great. So then you'd have an approved budget in May. And then you can, begin accepting project applications after that. Most communities kick off their season in early September. It's tough sometimes to meet during the summer, and folks aren't really, paying as close attention to your application period. So really opening that application period in early September makes a lot of sense. And then you would meet with the applicants, do your due diligence, make your recommendation votes over the fall and winter, and then vote on your first projects at the spring 2023 town meeting. So that's one suggestion. We find that works really well, but we've also found communities wanted to work a little quicker, and that's fine too. Any questions on that?
Yeah, so, while we have an annual meeting, we've often enough had a special town meeting, and just looking to see if what is the earliest time frame you could have a vote on a project proposal. Just trying to get the normal path, and what's the fast path, and then everything will be obviously in between.
Right. Because of the way municipal finance works, and I'm going to explain it in a little bit, but the only money you have between now and spring town meeting is to bond a project. So between now and then, you're really limited. You don't have access to any of that money that's coming in for FY22. So the first opportunity, unless you wanted to bond a project, which you could do at the very next town meeting, someone could call a town meeting, and in 3 weeks' time, you could be voting on a project and bonding it. But that would be the only way to do it before spring town meeting. So in the spring, you'll have your FY23 money to spend. So that would be the earliest you could do something. Does that answer your question, Jason?
So just to extend it then, so that's that does. Thank you for the bond part for this year. So then once we get past the annual town meeting, then if there was a special in the fall, we could have a vote.
You absolutely could.
Then. Okay.
Yep, you could. And we have a couple of communities that regularly have a fall town meeting, guaranteed like clockwork. It might even be in their charter. And they do their CPA projects in the fall because spring is a very busy time. There's a lot going on in your community in the spring. Rockport is one of those, and I think there's one or two more. Cambridge is another. It's pretty rare because, especially in a town, unless you have a guaranteed town meeting every fall, you're not going to call a town meeting just to do a few CPA projects and the CPA budget. That is just an expensive undertaking for the town, and you're not going to make the selectman and the town manager happy if you need to do that. So unless you regularly have a special town meeting in the fall, you're going to want to be doing it in the spring. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't accept some urgent projects at a fall town meeting. That's fine. You could have 2 rounds of funding a year, one timeline to accept projects for the fall town meeting, one for the spring. I wouldn't suggest that because you'll see it takes a lot to do due diligence and get these projects prepared and get the paperwork done and all that. Some communities started out with a real fire under their belly and said, we're going to do 2 rounds a year, or Northampton said, we're going to do 4 rounds of funding a year. Northampton does 1 round of funding a year now, because it's a lot of work, and you're not even finished up with the first round, and if you do it twice a year, the second one's right on top of you. So most of them, the vast majority, do it once a year in the spring. We have a couple that do it once a year in the fall. I don't know of anyone that regularly does 2 rounds anymore. They might do a regular round and then an emergency round for, with some criteria on that as to what constitutes an emergency. Any other questions on the timetable?
Yeah, just wanted to sort of follow up to that as well. Is there possible to have do you see CPC communities have, let's say, a pipeline to keep in the hopper, right? Saying unofficially, these are the projects that needs are still there, right? It's just if it doesn't make the cut, it kind of goes into the next thing to look at. Do you see communities do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what's in your plan, right? Your plan, one of the things when you look at these plans online, one of the things that some of the plans do is really, do a 5-year, just like you do a capital budget for the town of, which schools are going to get a new roof and which police cruisers are going to get replaced. You as part of your CPA can do like a 5-year plan based on the things you found out from all the other boards and committees, and you can kind of keep a pipeline going that way, Jason. So yes, we definitely see that. And sometimes you'll get far more applications than you have funding for. And, you can roll those forward, and say, okay, we can only do 7 out of these 10 this year, but we're automatically going to consider the next 3, in our next round of funding. So that's another way to build a pipeline.
Thank you.
All right, let's dig into the money piece of CPA, because that is the most fun, obviously. CPA has 2 main revenue sources in Shrewsbury. The first is your local surcharge revenue, and that's the 1% property tax surcharge that the voters approved at the ballot last year. And do you guys remember what that would bring in roughly? Was there an estimate done?
600,000. Well, campaign estimate. Okay, qualifier there.
Yep.
$600,000 local receipts with another 150. From the state, right?
Okay.
Thereabouts.
All right. Great. So maybe $750,000 or something like that. So that's, the 600,000 is what you're going to get from the property tax surcharge. And then the second big funding source, as Jason mentioned, is your annual distribution from the CPA trust fund, which comes every November. In addition, there is another small revenue source. The town is required to track the interest that is earned by the CPA revenue that is sitting right now. There's some CPA revenue sitting there from the tax bills that were paid over the summer. And at the end of the fiscal year, usually the town officials credit your account with your accrued interest from the money sitting in the CPA account. It's usually not like a separate bank account, at Bank of America. That's the CPA bank account. It's usually the money is, commingled with all the other town money, but on paper they keep track of these things, and the interest should be paid out to your CPA fund once a year. Oh, so let's dig into the trust fund now, because the local revenue of CPA is great, but I don't think we would have had 187 communities adopt CPA if the only funding source was your local taxes. You can always raise your local taxes through an override or whatever to do projects. The magic of CPA is this great funding source we have, this trust fund that brings a disbursement guaranteed every year in November. And it is a true trust fund. The money is collected at the registries of deeds and is sent to the Department of Revenue every month, and it is deposited in a trust fund. And the only thing DOR can do with that money is pay it out to the CPA communities as a match every November 15th. The funds for the CPA trust fund do not come from the regular budget of the state. In fact, the money is not even subject to appropriation by the legislature. It's a dedicated funding source. When CPA was signed into law by Governor Cellucci in 2000, they added a fee on top of all filings at the registries of deeds all across the state. There's always been a fee on filings at the registry. It's different prices for different documents. A deed is $175. Filing a mortgage at the registry is, I don't know, $125. There's trust documents. There's orders of conditions from the conscom when you build a new deck in near the wetlands. There's all sorts of filings at the registries of deeds, and they each have a register of charges. And on top of those, there's a CPA fee. When CPA was first passed in 2000, that fee was $20 for most documents filed at the registry and $10 for municipal lien certificates. The trust fund lived off that for 20 years, but the number of communities kept rising over those 20 years, and actually the real estate market slowed down. So we were down really low in revenue until a couple of years ago. And we were finally able, after a decade of work up on Beacon Hill, it really truly did take a decade. In 2019, they voted to increase those fees at the registry. So now the fee on top of most documents for CPA is $50 and municipal lien certificates are $25. And that has really done a terrific job in terms of bringing the match back up. We talk about the match in percentages. And last year, the base match was 28.6%. Now, when we say 28.6%, what we mean is 28.6% of what each community raised locally from their local surcharge. So if you raised $600,000 from your local surcharge last year and you were in the program, which you were not, you would have received a check from the trust fund for 28.6% of $600,000. Whatever that is, I'm not real good on math. If we want to use an example of $1 million in revenue, which is probably easier, Shrewsbury would have received a $286,000 check if they had had $1 million in local revenue. We were just about to go into the single digits before the trust fund increase was passed by the legislature. And now this year, the trust fund is going to make a distribution in about 2 weeks' time. And DOR estimated in the spring that it would be a 32% match, so up from single digits to 32. And frankly, the trust fund has really done terrific in those 6 months since that estimate was made. Our back of the envelope calculation is somewhere north of 35% for this year. The bad news is Shrewsbury doesn't get that. You won't get your first match till a year from now. You collect your local surcharge in your first year of CPA for a full year, and you get your first match at the end of that year. So your first year in CPA is FY22 this year. You began collecting your local money on July 1st. You'll do that through the end of the year, which is June 30th, 2022. And then next November, you will get your match for FY22, what you collected locally. Does that make sense to folks on the trust fund? All right, hearing no questions, we will move on. So this chart kind of illustrates how well that fee increase has worked. The trust fund year runs from November through the end of October. So they value the trust fund over 12 months, but it doesn't match the calendar year. It doesn't match the fiscal year. It's November through October. So the state probably over the weekend pulled the balance from the trust fund, to get working on their distribution. In the last full 12 months, when we had the old $20 fee, the trust fund brought in about $23.2 million. The first year of CPA back in FY 2002, it brought in $53 million. So you can see the decline in the activity at the real estate, as Refinancings have dried up because finance rates have been so low for so long. Most people have refinances. There's not a lot of inventory on the market. So the trust fund revenue on its own dipped from 53 million the very first year to 23 million over the next 18 years or so. Now, this year, November 15th match will be the first one with 12 full months at the new fee structure. And the trust fund through the end of September, we don't have October's figures yet, has already brought in $76 million. So in 11 months, it's brought in $76 million. The last year of the old fee structure, 12 months, brought in $23 million. So we'll be up over $80 million when October is added in. So it's been a really terrific adjustment for us, and a hard-fought victory at the State House with a lot of people across the state working on this with us. And it's a great time to have joined CPA because the match is finally going to be really robust again, like it was, 20 years ago. All right, so now you know about the two different funding sources, and those two funding sources together make up your annual revenue. So let's talk about the first task for your CPC on a yearly basis, which is to recommend a budget to town meeting. Just like your town passes a municipal budget every year at the spring town meeting, you're going to recommend a CPA budget to town meeting that they're going to vote on. Like I said, most communities do it at the same time as the municipal budget. Now, FY22 is a special case. So this year, the money for CPA is going to be handled differently, and I'll get into that in a second. But in the spring, you'll do a budget for FY23. And you work with the municipal officials to get the estimates on what they think they're going to collect. You do a budget, you work out the numbers, the CPC votes on that, and then you send it to town meeting. The selectmen put it on the warrant, and town meeting votes on it. So it all starts with your projections on what CPA will bring in during FY23. That's not something you folks can do. So you'll work with your finance department. Sometime over the winter, when we're getting closer to budget planning time, your municipal officials will be able to give you an estimate on the CPA revenue for FY23. Every March, DOR comes out with an estimate for the trust fund distribution. And those two things together, form the total revenue figure that you need to do your budget. So you'll begin working on this, after the new year, when the town begins working on budgeting itself for next year. So the CPA legislation gives surprisingly few restrictions on what you can do with that money. Obviously, it's the 4 categories, right? It's a restricted fund there: housing, open space, recreation, and historic. But beyond that, and this one basic tenet I'm about to explain to you, you have tremendous flexibility in how you spend that money. The one thing you do have to do, according to the CPA legislation, every year you have to spend or set aside for later spending 10% of what you expect to collect that year in 3 different reserve accounts. So if you expect, just for round numbers, $1 million in total revenue, you are going to have to recommend every year a housing project that is worth $100,000 or more, that you're spending $100,000 or more, or 10% of your budget. Or more likely, you're just going to take that $100,000 and transfer it to your housing reserve account. So the rule is spend or reserve each fiscal year 10% of your total revenue for each of these 3 things. Now, the open space and recreation categories share a reserve account. By open space, we mean conservation land, so fields, forests, farms, wetlands, those sort of things, watershed protection land. That's conservation land in general. That's open space. Recreation is more active land: parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, any type of outdoor recreation. And those two share a reserve account. So if you're buying a piece of conservation land, you can use some money from that open space reserve account. If you're rehabilitating a park with new playground equipment, you can also use money from that reserve account if you want to. In addition, at your option, you can ask town meeting to set aside 5% of the total CPA revenue for an administrative budget for your Community Preservation Committee operations. And we'll talk more about what that fund does. And beyond that, it's completely up to you. Most communities, every year look at the applications that come in, and without really, playing favorites to one category or another, they pick the projects that are best for the community as a whole. In Cambridge, they are really focused on housing, and they tend to spend every year the vast majority of their money on housing. They have to spend 10% on historic and 10% on open space, a little administrative money, and then pretty much everything else in Cambridge goes to housing. That's what they've identified as their priority. In my town, I live in a very rural town up on the North Shore. We never met a piece of open space that we didn't want to own for the town. We are, absolute demons on buying open space. So we're spending a lot more on open space than we are on historic preservation. But in Plymouth, it's all about historic preservation, a very historic city. Salem, kind of the same thing. So you have tremendous flexibility when you're recommending your projects and creating your budget on how you want to do your spending in Shrewsbury. So let's step through what an actual budget will look like, and I'll apply some numbers here to give you an idea of what you're going to be working on come early spring for FY23. So let's say you have $1 million in revenue. Between DOR and your local officials, they've given you projections on FY23, and they expect you're going to have $1 million to spend. So you're working on the FY23 budget. You probably are not going to have any projects by then. Let's pretend you don't. So you're going to have to recommend to town meeting that 10% of that $1 million goes into each of the 3 reserve accounts. So $100,000 into the housing reserve, $100,000 into the historic reserve, and $100,000 into the open space and recreation reserve. So that leaves $700,000 of anticipated revenue left. We suggest you ask for the full 5% for administrative expenses from town meeting, which would be $50,000. You never know what kind of due diligence you're going to need to do in the coming year, what kind of projects are going to walk in the door. And there's no danger in asking for an allocation of the full 5%. Whatever you don't spend, and most communities don't come anywhere close to spending 5% on administration, that flows right back into the CPA fund at the end of the year, and town meeting gives you a new 5% administrative budget. So that's $50,000. So now you've got $650,000 left to budget for. Let's say you have no projects to spend that on. Because of the way municipal finance works, you can't just leave that $650,000 hanging out there as anticipated revenue. You have to budget for every dollar you expect to receive if you want to be able to use that money throughout the fiscal year. So you're going to want to put that $650,000. You're going to want to recommend that be transferred to a temporary account called the budgeted reserve. And that means you have now done a budget and you've tucked every dollar of that million into an account somewhere. And that's the idea of the budget, is to tuck all the spending into these various accounts or into project accounts, so that town meeting passes a budget for all the revenue you expect to receive. And if you put that $650,000 that you don't have any use for at town meeting into the budgeted reserve, now it's available to you for the entire fiscal year of FY23. If you have a special town meeting in the fall and you need some of it, if you want to spend some at next spring's town meeting, a year from now, spring's town meeting, you've got it for the full fiscal year. If you left that money hanging out there as just anticipated revenue, you would lose access to it when the town set its tax rate, which is coming up in a couple weeks. And you wouldn't get it back until the town closes its books over the summer. So to avoid that 6 months or so of a blackout period on using that money, you want to put it in a budgeted reserve. Any questions on that?
Yes, I have a question, Stuart. This is
Okay.
Gail Aslanian. On that 5% of administrative expenses, is that just for the committee, or does that include like legal advice and stuff like that on projects, or does that money come out of the project budget? Like if you
Right.
have legal things done, filing,
Okay.
legal
Yep.
advice?
So if something is specific to a project, you want to put that in the project budget at town meeting. So for example, if you are recommending $100,000 to buy a piece of open space, you're probably going to want to recommend a town meeting, $120,000, because buying open space has a lot of legal expenses and due diligence costs and all sorts of other related filing fees and that sort of thing. So you're going to want to know ahead of time what those expenses might be and put them in the project budget. Some communities just regularly put a 10% contingency in every project budget for those sort of things. The admin budget is for the expenses of your committee in fulfilling its statutory duties, the Community Preservation Committee's running of your committee. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide when I dig into the administrative expenses.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on the annual?
Yes, Steve.
Yes.
Steve has a
Hi,
question.
Steve.
Yeah, hi. Quick question. So the money that goes in budgeted reserve is not going to be allocated to any particular project. What are the conditions? So do you have a certain amount of time that money can only sit, or is there a certain balance configuration that goes? So in other words, you just can't keep throwing money into this and not spending it on something, right?
Well, not into the budgeted reserve. So the budgeted reserve is a temporary account that lasts for just one fiscal year. So in the case we just used as an example, Steve, you put $650,000 in your budgeted reserve for FY23, right? Now, let's say you go through all of FY23 and you don't spend it. Okay, you have taken a long time to get up and organized, and you're not ready to do projects for a long time. West Newbury took 3 years before they did their first project. Milton, not Milton, Watertown, another a W community, Watertown. Sorry about that. Took 2.5 years before they did their first project. So let's say that $650,000 sits in the budgeted reserve for the entire fiscal year of FY23. At the end of that year, the money is transferred to an account called your fund balance. Your fund balance is basically your savings account. It's the money that you're carrying forward year to year that you haven't spent yet. So the budgeted reserve is a temporary account. The money sits there for a year, and then it's transferred automatically over the summer when the town closes its books. You don't have to do a thing. They'll transfer it to your fund balance, and then you can spend it at a future town meeting. There is no requirement that you do projects in a given year. Some communities, skip a year here and there because they're saving up for a big project. You can spend all your money every year. You can spend a portion of it and hold some back, or you don't have to spend a thing. The CPC is completely in charge of that and completely in charge of your own budget.
Okay, and one other question on, so we're allocating money, the 10% in the other individual accounts. Is there a requirement, and I apologize if you mentioned this prior to my logging in, is there a requirement that you have to rotate? So I know you mentioned about some communities that did, they only do historic, or you have to do something with each one of these particular strategies, correct?
Yes. So each year, you either have to do a minimum of 10% spending on each of these 3 areas, or you have to put that money in the reserve account. And there's nothing wrong with, just putting it in the reserve account every year until a really good project in that category comes along. You don't want to do, a historic project next year, that's not a very good project just because you have to spend the money, right? You want to do the best projects that are out there, really, no matter what category they're in. So If you don't have a strong roster or any historic projects that year, just put the 10% in that, and it'll keep building up. Some communities, really struggle with the housing piece of CPA. Some of our tiny communities that don't have professional staff, they have a tough time doing housing development. And so they might build up, 4 or 5 years of money in their housing reserve account until, a good project comes along, or frankly, until they have enough money to do much with. If you're a small community, housing's expensive. You might have to save up money for a number of years before you do your first housing development.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the budget?
Are there other slides relative to the budget, or is there, if I correct me wrong, is there also a breakout for finances as a different webinar?
A breakout for finances.
Yeah.
Tell me what you mean.
Meaning additional training on just the finance piece alone.
No, we have a great article on our website, which I can send you, which kind of explains the whole budgeting process and gives examples and things like that. But you don't have to, track this money. That's the job of your town. So they'll, get training from DOR on how to set up the accounts and the books in the system, and how to apply the revenue and how to apply the expenses and what money goes where, at which times of the year. But we don't offer any of the detailed training on the accounting and budgeting, because that's just not something that we're adept at. That's really DOR's job to do that.
Right.
DOR used to do actually statewide conferences and things like that, just for CPA things. They've really had a lot of cutbacks over the years in their staff. Occasionally, they offer some training at their annual training for municipal officials on CPA, but mostly that's done through directly working with DOR.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. So let's move on and talked a lot about, your budget on a typical year, starting with FY23, but you still have a little work to do to clean up FY22. So you did not do a budget before your tax rate was set. And in fact, almost no communities in their first year of CPA have time to do a budget. They're just not organized in time. And once the tax rate is set, which is going to be in a couple weeks for Shrewsbury, that's it. That locks everything in, and it's too late to do a budget. So it's not uncommon. Matter of fact, it's very common that you don't have time after you're organized to get a budget together for the first year. And that's okay. It does mean that you have no money to spend this year, either in the administrative account or on the project side. If a real true emergency came along, you could issue a bond. That's the only funding you have available to yourselves between now and Springtown meeting in May. You could call a special town meeting and the CPC could recommend bonding on a project. It has happened a couple times when emergencies have come along really quickly, but it's not too common. So there is still one task, though, that you are responsible for that FY22 money, and that is it doesn't absolve you, even though you didn't do a budget, of the requirement to have 10% in each of the 3 reserve accounts. But since DOR knew that the CPC wouldn't be formed in time to recommend a budget to town meeting for the first year, they allow your municipal officials to make that transfer themselves. So this is the only year, FY22, where the CPC doesn't have to recommend and town meeting does not have to approve the 10% reserve accounts. They'll do that at the city when they close the books next summer. It's certainly something that you'd want to work with them on, so you know what the amounts are that they're doing. And you could even, take a vote at your meeting once you get the numbers. I move to remind the municipal finance officials to transfer $60,000 to each of the 3 reserve accounts, whatever it is. But they'll wait till the end of the fiscal year, most probably, till they have an actual figure on your local collections. And then over the summer, as they close the books, they'll make those transfers for FY22. that make sense? All right. So now let's dig into the administrative account a little bit. As I mentioned, you can request and town meeting can approve up to 5% of your estimated revenues, and it's your estimated total revenues, your match from the state plus your local revenue. And whatever you don't spend as part of the closing process at the end of the fiscal year, your municipal officials will put that into your fund balance, and hopefully town meeting will have authorized you a new administrative account. So because you didn't have a town meeting this year with CPA budgeting, you will not have an administrative account until at the earliest July 1st, 2022, the beginning of FY23. If town meeting approves it next May, you'll be able to spend administrative money starting on July 1st, 2022. The thing about this account is it is for the expenses of running your committee. It is not a CPA administrative account for Shrewsbury's CPA program. So let me say that again. This is an important distinction, and it's a nuance, but it's important. The money is for your committee and doing its statutory responsibility and how you decide you need to spend that administrative money. It is not to be used by any other department or department head or board or committee for their work on CPA. It's your administrative account. So the tax collector is going to spend a little bit of time collecting the CPA surcharge money. The town clerk is going to spend a little bit of time, typing up the 6 warrant articles that you submit for CPA projects in your budget. Your finance officials are going to spend a little time doing an estimate on the local surcharge revenue so you can do your budget. Those are just tasks that they're all doing as part of their regular job out of their administrative budgets. Your administrative budget is for your committee and the expenses it might have. So let's give you an example of some of those expenses. Well, you might want to hire someone to help you with administering CPA. Anecdotally, I'd say about 60% of our communities have someone supporting them. The earliest you'd be able to do that is July 1st of 2022. And it can be, a variety of different formats. Some communities hire an independent contractor who just has an hourly rate and they send an invoice to the CPC to approve for whatever they work. Some communities hire a part-time brand new staffer that has a desk and sits at town hall and works 15 hours a week or 20 hours a week on CPA things, or 10 hours a week, whatever it is. What you can't do is pay someone who's already on staff at the town of Shrewsbury to do their CPA work, because that would be supplanting. They're already in the general fund. They have a budget for their department. All their employees are covered by that budget. If you pay some of their salary with CPA, you have supplanted general municipal spending. You have moved money from the CPA fund into the general fund, and those two accounts are completely separate. Never shall the general fund of a city or town mix with the CPA fund. So you can hire someone new. You can hire an independent consultant. If you have a part-time person at town hall, you could add to their hours. We did that in our town. We had a 32-hour conservation agent who was excellent, and he wanted to work full-time, and it was just about the time we needed some help with CPA. And so we paid for the extra 8 hours of his time. So the ConsCom continued to pay for 32 hours out of their budget. We paid for 8 hours out of the CPA administrator budget. So that's one thing you can do. Generally, I don't see communities hire someone right away. Number one, they usually don't have an administrative account the first year. And it's really when the project applications start rolling in and the projects start being implemented, that's when it gets really busy, and you might want to consider having a support person. The other thing you'd use on your administrative account is, any kind of consultants that you feel you need. If you want to have a historic preservation consultant look at some plans that someone submitted to rehab a historic building. If you have a legal question, the CPC has a legal question. You don't have, access to town council. You usually have to go through your town manager's office. But if you have a question, the town council should charge your CPC administrative question to answer that, administrative budget to answer that question. If the selectman or the town manager have a question on CPA, they should pay that out of their legal budget. But if you have a question, you can pay it out of the administrative budget. Due diligence on projects. You're going to get a lot of projects submitted, and you're really going to want to dig into them. If you get an application for buying a piece of open space from the CONSCOM, and they say it's worth $1 million, well, the CPA legislation requires you to have an appraisal. And appraisals aren't cheap. It's $4,000 to $6,000 or even more to do an appraisal. CONSCOM probably doesn't have that money. So, that's part of your due diligence in looking at the project before town meeting. You want to determine if it's worth what you're being asked to pay for it. So you'll get an appraisal. You have to run some newspaper ads to advertise your public hearing. You might have some expenses to run the public hearing. You might want to entice people to come to your public hearing. You might want to buy some pizza and food, because more people come when you're going to be serving food. That's a fine administrative expense. You might want to print up some banners that you keep in stock. And when a project is under construction, you go and hang a big banner that says, thank you, citizens of Shrewsbury, your CPA funds at work, or something like that. And they're canvas banners, and you put them up during the construction, take them down and reuse them somewhere else. You might want to publish a little newsletter to folks. You might want to build a little website for CPA, whatever it is that your committee feels they need to keep folks in touch with what's happening with CPA and doing the project due diligence. Those are fair game for the administrative account. Any questions on the admin funds? All right, let's dive in. All right, so I mentioned that the CPA fund and the administrative fund, the CPA fund and the general fund of the town of Shrewsbury are different entities, different budgets. So in general, they're kind of the opposite of each other. A municipal budget is really something that is, mostly a top-down affair. There's not a lot of input the average person in Shrewsbury can make into the municipal budget. It's usually done by, the town manager, the selectmen, the finance committee, department heads. They're kind of determining that. Of course, town meeting gets to vote on it, but in formulating that budget, it's mostly a top-down process. CPA is designed to be exactly the opposite. It's a bottoms-up approach. It's no accident that this is called the Community Preservation Fund. It's a voluntary tax increase that everyone in the community voted for. And the money and the ideas for how to spend the money should really come from the community. So, you want to really take your cues on what the priorities are from everyone out there, from the organizations in town, the nonprofits, the committees, the boards, town staff as well. Everyone should have an opportunity to weigh in on what are great CPA projects. It's an opportunity for the town to really dream and think big. Most CPA projects are quality of life things that would never, ever fit into the regular municipal budget. There's just too much pressure on that budget to run the schools, police, fire, roads, pension payments. There's no fat in that budget. And the quality of life things are the first things that get cut. When Salem adopted CPA, I remember this jubilation on the face of the chair of the Recreation Committee, the Parks Committee. And he said, we haven't had a dime of capital spending for our parks in Salem in 12 years. They've done maintenance, cut the grass, and that's about it. And they were in tough shape. It's just these quality of life things often don't fit in the budget. And it's an opportunity to really dig into some things that will be tremendous for the community that CPA can pay for that you wouldn't ordinarily have. And those ideas really come from the ground up. The communities that get this, both on the town staff and department side and the general public and CPC side, those are the communities that really have tremendous CPA programs. You are definitely going to want to do some of the town's priorities that, the town officials' priorities that they couldn't get done otherwise. And you're definitely going to want to do some, really thinking big, let's try this and let's hope it works, but it's a gamble, but boy, wouldn't it be great, if we were able to do that type of projects. The communities where, the CPC sort of allows the municipal budget to sort of take control of the 1% CPA surcharge, and you find the money really just being spent on priorities from town hall. Those are the programs where we see a lot of gnashing of teeth and butting of heads and a bumpy road. So it's a great thing to think about. What kind of CPA program do you want to have? How much independence do you want to have in making sure that the community at large is really heard on their priorities? All right, so we've talked mostly about the revenue coming in. Now let's talk about how all these great projects are done across the state and how that process happens. The most important piece of CPA paper that exists, if you imagine this slide as a piece of paper and you can print one out from our website, is this chart we call the CPA allowable uses chart. This is the simplified version of the chart. There is a version on our website that the Department of Revenue put out, which has a little bit more detail because it has definitions for all these words on their chart. But these definitions are all in Section 2 of the Act, a definition of what is a historic resource. There is an actual definition for most of these things. Section 2 of the CPA legislation is really the heart of the legislation. It's all the definitions, and in most legislation, the definitions of the words are really where the rubber meets the road. So that's a good section of the law to read. And the allowable uses for CPA are written in the legislation in Section 5B2. And it's this long paragraph of gobbledygook legalese that is very hard to understand. And in fact, 20 years ago when CPA was first passed, the first communities, we didn't really have a very good idea of what this money could be spent on. And when DOR came out with this chart in like 2003 or 2004, it was like a light bulb went off in everyone's head because it's so much easier to visualize things, when you have a chart or photos. Pictures worth 1,000 words type of thing. So this is the chart you always want to have handy. Some CPCs put it on a big piece of foam core and hang it on the wall during every meeting. When you get approached, in the supermarket and someone says, hey, Steve, I heard you're on the new CPA committee. Do you think we could use the money to build a new blank, blank, blank? The first thing you want to look at is the CPA allowable uses chart. So, you probably aren't going to want to carry one around in your back pocket. I'm a CPA geek and I've been known to do that, but it's really a handy document. The first time it comes up, hey, can we spend money on this? And that will come up over and over and over again. Probably 60% or more of the technical assistance requests we get are questions on allowable use. And we love working through them, and we always put the chart in front of us when we help communities work through their allowable use questions. So how do you use this chart? Well, we all know the 4 restricted categories of CPA, right? That's pretty common. You can only do things in the open space, historic, recreation, and housing categories. But not everything in those categories is eligible for funding. The lesser known part of the CPA legislation is that each expenditure has to be justified by one of these verbs that you're seeing along the left side here: acquire, create, preserve, support, rehabilitate. And not every verb is available in every box either. So you really have to look not only at the category and the definition of what it can be spent on, but then you need to look at these verbs. And you really need to do it on a line by line item level in the budget. It's not good enough to just look at the idea, oh, can we build a new park? Yes, possibly. But until you see the budget for that park and find a box on this chart for each line item, you don't know if it's truly eligible. And if you have an expense in a project budget and you can't find a yes box to stuff that expense in, that part of the project is not eligible for funding, or that project entirely is not eligible for funding. You have to find a box that says yes to be able to stuff that expense into in order for it to qualify. So let's give two examples of how this works. One of the examples I use all the time because it's pretty a good illustration of this is in the historic category. Let's say you get an application to do an oral history of all the remaining World War II veterans in Shrewsbury. They won't be around for very much longer. They have great stories about what it was like to represent Shrewsbury in World War II and come home after the war. And you want to get that all, you want to hire a video production company, get their video, get them on video being interviewed, transcribe it, do some interpretive stuff, make copies, etc. So is that eligible for funding? Well, let's go to the chart. It's obviously a historic property, but the definition of historic resources is a building, structure, vessel, meaning a boat, real property, document, or artifact. Those are the 6 assets you can spend money on. So in doing this oral history, are you acquiring a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact? Are you buying one of those things with CPA money for the town? No, you are not. Are you preserving one of those things? The definition of preserve is protecting the asset from injury, harm, or destruction. Are you preserving a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact? Nope. And you're not rehabilitating one of those 6 assets either. The oral history is not eligible for CPA funding. It's a terrific historic project, but CPA can't pay for everything. It's still a pretty modest funding source. And it's a specific funding source. And in this case, you can't do that project. Now, let's say you receive another historic application and the town facilities committee, if you have one, or the capital planning committee or the selectmen are asking some money to rehabilitate your historic town hall. I don't know if the town hall is historic in Shrewsbury. Let's say it was. And they want to spend $1 million doing some rehabilitation work on town hall. Well, you're not acquiring town hall because you already own it, right? So that's not, box is no good. You can't create something historic. So you couldn't build a new town hall. That makes sense, right? The legislature got that right. You can't create something in the historic category. Are you preserving town hall? Maybe. I mean, the roof, a new roof might be preservation if it's leaking and destroying the building. But the box here, that's the real play, is rehabilitation. When you fix up town hall and bring it back to all its glory from when it opened in 1862, and you do that rehabilitation work, you are rehabilitating a historic resource, and that is definitely eligible for CPA funding. Those expenses would fit in the yes box for historic rehabilitation. So, does that make sense to folks in terms of a high level view? This will take a while to sink in, honestly. And we're happy to help. In fact, most communities, we offer, every community, most communities take us up on it. Your first round of project applications you get in, we can schedule, an hour-long Zoom call or Google Meets call and work through those applications. And we can help you figure out how to apply this chart to each one of those real live applications. So any questions on the allowable use spending?
Yes, I have one, Stuart, in respect to the support column.
Yep.
Could you explain that a little bit and how you, I'm assuming support means like maintenance and upkeep and that kind of stuff. Is that what support is you referring to?
Nope. Yep, because support is available. You can see in the housing category. but
Right.
in no aspect of CPA can you ever do maintenance.
Right.
And you can never use CPA, or in most cases, CPA cannot be used for operating expenses. So those two things are no-nos. So what support means is some activity that doesn't directly work on an asset in that category, but it supports the category in general. So if the support box said yes in the historic category, I think you probably could have done that that oral history project, Gail. Because that
Yep.
oral history really is a supporting task to the historic category. But it's only available in the housing category. And you can see the housing category, is the only one that has 4 solid yeses. And that's because the legislature knew housing was going to be really difficult. There's so many other activities that you need to do before you ever get a shovel in the ground, that they wanted you to be able to do things in the housing category that just generally support the development of affordable housing. So writing a housing production plan, hiring a housing coordinator for the town to work on development of new affordable housing, doing rental assistance programs for residents. All these other related things are all fair game in the housing category, but not in any of the other categories.
Okay, so excuse me. On the website, there's many examples of historic preservation being used for other purposes other than the original intention. So like a library is not used as a library anymore, but it's a gathering space or something. What play does CPA money have in that? As far as I know, you can't maintain it. So who's responsible for that? Do you have to set up foundations? You have to, if the town doesn't want that responsibility, how do you
Right.
take it the next step?
Okay. So I'm assuming you're asking about a municipal building, right?
Well, yeah. Oh, it can be a municipal, but if it was a municipal building that the town did not want to have responsibility for,
Okay. So
then
there's 2 questions here. You asked first, why do we see projects in the database where a historic town hall is now being used for housing,
right,
or an old town library is now being used as a senior center, and CPA money helped rehabilitate it. In the historic category, in that particular category, CPA doesn't really care what you use the building for. It's all about rehabilitating and preserving the actual historic structure. So in fact, unless a historic building has a purpose, it's going to be mothballed and it's going to deteriorate and it's going to end up being torn down.
right,
So it's all about preserving that historic building. So if it's no longer fits the town's needs as a town hall, let's find another use for it. And CPA money could absolutely rehabilitate the entire building for that use. And we've had hundreds of projects where historic buildings have been reused for something else and CPA paid for the rehabilitation work. It's called adaptive reuse, basically. So that is a huge part of CPA. It doesn't matter what's going to be in there. It's all about doing the right thing by the building and doing the proper historic preservation work on that building.
and
Now,
does it still have to be a public use at that point, right? It has to be used public. It has to be open to the public.
if it was a town-owned building,
Yeah.
it would have to in some way benefit the public. So,
Yeah. Oh, okay.
could you, let's say you had back office operations for the town, none of the customer facing departments like the water board wanted to move in there, and the public really never went in that building. It still has public benefit, right? It's housing a public, department. So, it has to have some type of public benefit. Now, you asked about private historic buildings. Now, that is a big part of CPA as well. It's a longer process with private historic buildings, and we'll have to talk about that at another time, because you can't just give money to a private organization for their benefit. there has to be some public benefit. So if you're going to give money to a private organization, it has to be to fulfill a public use, a public benefit. And we don't have time to really get into that in detail tonight. But there is an article on our website in the historic category on the technical assistance page, and it's called "Can CPA Fund Private Projects?" And it really gets into the criteria that you need to have for public use.
Right.
No matter, yep. No, and your last question, no matter who you give this money to do the capital, rehabilitation work, whether it's the town doing it on a town building or the historical society doing it on their museum that's open to the public, that entity is going to have to maintain it and do the repairs and pay the oil bill to keep the building heated and change the filter in the air conditioning system and vacuum the floors. You can do the capital work and the rehabilitation work and the preservation work, but operating and maintenance is the responsibility of whoever owns that building. Any other questions on the allowable uses chart? All right, so let's move on.
Just want to call it, you can also split up, like a project could dip into two categories, right? As long as they qualify.
Yes,
right?
It's not as common as you might think, but the one place we sometimes see it is when an unused historic building is adaptively reused as housing, affordable housing. Or even affordable and market rate housing together. That's one area. It's hard to combine most of the others. You can buy a piece of land and use it for multiple purposes. We bought a piece of land in our town, and it has 12 acres of land right up against the road that's reserved for housing. It's not built yet, but then we have soccer fields in the middle, and then we have 50 acres of open space and hiking trails, and Blanding's turtle habitat in the back. So that's a good use of multiple pots, is when you buy land.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So there is nothing in the CPA legislation about who can apply for funds. But there's a common theme. By far the two biggest applicants are, a board, a committee, a department head within the Shrewsbury, town of Shrewsbury, or a nonprofit organization in Shrewsbury that performs some real public benefit or uses their building in some public benefit way, like a museum or a nonprofit affordable housing developer, that sort of thing. There are some other types of entities that apply for CPA funding, and CPA funds, and we just urge caution. Sometimes you'll get an application from a non-incorporated, loose entity of folks. So, Friends of Johnson Park, group, or the West Side Neighborhood Association, which is really involved, interested people who are excited about improving their little corner of the world. And they want to apply, to fix up a town park, that's been neglected in their part of town or something like that. But you can't give them the money to do that. They don't have control of the asset. They're not in charge. They're not an incorporated entity. You can't just hand them public money. So, there are ways to work that through, but it would have to be done carefully with whoever is in charge of that asset actually handling the money. Same thing with individual homeowners. Some communities get applications from people who own historic homes, or they are folks who are of modest income, moderate or low income, but they live in a market rate home and they ask for funding to fix up their units. There might be ways to do that, but you have to be very, very careful on that to make it fair for everybody and to adhere to the procurement laws of the state and the fair housing laws, etc. So those are a little more complicated, not impossible, but those are more complicated projects to do. The process is pretty similar in most communities, although, believe it or not, the CPA legislation says nothing about the process you use. It actually starts at the point where it says the CPC shall make recommendations to town meeting for, and then it lists all those spending criteria from the allowable uses chart. So it says nothing about how you get to that point. But in fact, most communities, develop an application, and we have some great examples of applications on our website. And feel free to beg, borrow, and steal those applications. We also have great CPA plans on our website. We try to put everything in a Word document or a live Excel spreadsheet, that sort of thing, because 170 communities have done this work before Shrewsbury. So you're all volunteers. You don't have paid professional staff yet. You might get a little bit of help from town staff and planning department and things like that if they can do it. But in general, we want to make this as easy as possible. So there's great ideas in these other plans and applications. Cut, paste, and use it. And we're all kind of in this together, and we all share information among communities, and our organization kind of facilitates that. So you'll come up with an application. People will fill out that application and submit it usually by a deadline. You folks are going to review that, do your due diligence, get input, and then you're going to take a vote at your committee meeting, and you're going to make specific recommendations on the use of the money for individual projects to town meeting, and then town meeting will vote on them. In most cases, it's a majority vote to pass the CPA project at town meeting. There are some examples where a 2/3 majority is required. If you are bonding a project by Massachusetts general law, bonds have to be issued with a 2/3 vote of the legislative body, town meeting. If you are taking a piece of land by eminent domain for CPA purposes, that requires a 2/3 vote at town meeting. And most town councils require a town meeting to vote land acquisitions with a 2/3 vote as well. If you're buying some kind of real property, building or land, usually that requires a 2/3 vote too, although there is some disagreement among town councils in Massachusetts, and the case law is really unclear and old. So there are some communities that only require a majority vote, but more require 2/3 on land and building acquisitions. Once you guys make those recommendations, it's pretty much handled, like any other warrant article, although town meeting's role is a slight bit more limited than normal. They can approve your project recommendation. They can reject your project recommendation. They can approve it, but at a reduced amount. What they can't do is make a wholesale substantial change to your warrant article, because town meeting cannot vote on a CPA project unless it has first been recommended to town meeting by the CPC. So if they substantially change through amendments at town meeting a CPA article, it's not your recommendation anymore. So they've turned a project warrant article of something that could be voted on to something that can't be voted on. So amendments that are substantial to that article, most amendments are not allowed, because that would change your recommendation. This last item I've never seen used. It's pretty rare. Town meeting can reject the project, but order that the money instead be sent to the applicable reserve account. Never seen it used. I'm not even quite sure why it's in the legislation. Never been able to track that one down, but we have never seen it be used. All right, was there a question there, or just someone taking a breath? All right, we are in the home stretch here. There are some general rules about CPA. There aren't a lot in the legislation where it says you absolutely can't do this, but there are a few. And here's a good kind of basic tenets of CPA. As we talked about a little bit, CPA funds can never be transferred back into the general budget. So, for example, if the town paid for something out of another funding source and then they want to later get reimbursed by CPA, that is not okay. You can't pay for things that are just normally part of the town's regular business that are traditionally paid for out of the general fund. And you can't pay any of the time of town officials when they work on CPA issues. If the Department of Public Works, if you fund them to build a new park, CPA can pay for all the materials and equipment and outside consultants and clerk of the works and fencing and everything involved. They can't pay for the time of the town employees who are overseeing that project, however. So you can never have money from CPA go back into the general municipal fund or supplant general municipal spending. That's one of the basic tenets of CPA. We talked about no maintenance or operating expenses. The recreation category of CPA is outdoor only. It's actually the definition of recreational land in CPA is actually a subset of open space. So it's for projects that take place in a relatively natural setting outside, either with no built environment like conservation land, or parks, playgrounds, athletic fields that are pretty open but might have small, structures on it, like a storage shed or a gazebo or a picnic pavilion or something like that, benches, lighting, those sort of things. Whenever you acquire something with CPA funds, it has to be permanently protected for that purpose. You acquire land for conservation purposes, it's put under control of the CONSCOM, and a local land trust holds a conservation restriction on that property, and it will stay conservation land forever. You buy land to build affordable housing, that has to stay used for affordable housing forever. The last thing is, we can, as I mentioned briefly, you can use bonding as a funding source for your CPA projects. You are bonding against the future CPA revenue stream, the same way the town bonds against its future general tax revenue stream to build a school or buy a police car, or put a new roof on town hall. You can do that. It does ratchet up the vote at town meeting to 2/3, as I mentioned. And of course, it's going to increase your costs because now you're paying a little bit of interest as well. But municipal bonds are a lot better rates than we can get as individuals on mortgages and things. So bonding is very popular. There's $400 million of outstanding CPA bonds at this point, and well over 100 communities have bonded at least one project. So it is a powerful thing. If Shrewsbury gets ready to do that, once you have your budget in hand and you have your projects, we have a half-hour separate, very short bonding presentation we'd be happy to do for you. So we are at 20 to 8, and we promised no more than 2 hours. This is the last section of the presentation where I give some interesting examples of what communities have done with their CPA money in each of the 4 categories. Probably takes about 7 to 10 minutes to go through, but I know some folks might be hungry or tired, or looking to get through to their families. So I usually pause at this point and say, do you want me to go through this quick little section, or we can take some more questions and call it a night?
Stuart, I have a question. This is Kathy McSweeney. I have a question on the last slide. Can we go back for a second?
Absolutely.
Thank you. On the no supplanting general municipal revenue, just an example, we have a large body of water in town that the town currently pays for maintenance. I think there's a de-weeding or something that they do annually. So that's not something we could take over because it's something that the town's currently doing. And how long would the town have to not do it for us to take it over, because it is becoming a budget item?
Right. So that is actually not okay for 2 reasons. One, it's supplanting something the town has had in its budget for a while. But more importantly, it's maintenance. If you're doing something every year or on a regular schedule, that's maintenance. So that wouldn't be eligible for both those reasons, but even more importantly, the maintenance issue. Now, some folks have pointed out, and this is true, if you let a town asset go without any maintenance for so long that it needs a complete capital rehabilitation, which CPA could pay for, that is true. You can defer maintenance forever, and then it becomes so bad that you need a complete capital improvement, and CPA could pay for that. It sounds cute. I really don't know of any community that is deliberately ignoring one of their assets, whether it be a pond or a building or a field, just so they can use CPA money in 10 years. It sounds, it's a good point, but I just don't know of that really happening out there in the field. So that's the answer to that question. Any other questions? Should we do this last little section, Jason, or call it a night? I'll turn it back to you.
All right, sorry, my internet connection went down, so I just dialed into my phone. It sounds like you're wrapping up there, asking for final questions. Am I correct?
Yes, and I gave everyone the option if they want to see this these few slides we have here of examples of what you can use CPA money on and what other communities are doing. We can roll through that real quick. Do folks want to do that or call it?
I'm in favor of doing that.
Okay.
And
All
if
right.
people have to log off, they can log off.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Any other questions I should take before that?
Well, I do want to point out we do have other minor agenda items here. Just so if any folks that need to come off, we do want to please speak up now because we do need to review, discuss, and accept the minutes from October 4th. So August, October 4th, and also set our next meeting date. So just want to folks don't drop off.
I'll give the express version here. I'll go through these quickly. Does that sound good?
Yes, please. Thank you.
I think my record is about 5 to 6 minutes. So, all right. In the historic preservation category, this is definitely the most popular use to do restoration of historic municipal buildings. That gold leaf is going on the dome at Needham Town Hall. We put that in here because it is the largest ever CPA project, still to this day, and it's an older project. But they spent $15 million doing a spectacular top-to-bottom rehab. Anytime you see gold leaf going on a building, you know it was an expensive project, and CPA did it. Gloucester City Hall up above, CPA was passed in Gloucester for the specific purpose of rehabbing that town hall. It's a spectacular building. It was designed up on a hill, so as the fishermen in Gloucester made the final turn for home in the harbor, they looked up, they saw they were home, they saw the tower. And so a real iconic building, and that was the very first expenditure on CPA funds in Gloucester. We talked about adaptive reuse. So top right, that's an old shoe factory in Middleborough that is being rehabbed into affordable housing. That yellow building was a surplus library in Cohasset that is now 2 units of affordable housing. And Chelmsford is breaking ground on their center town hall, which is not a town hall anymore. And CPA funds rehabbed the whole thing, and it was turned over to a nonprofit to run as an art center, leasing it from the town for $1 a year. Also, we talked about private projects. There are some guardrails you have to put on this because it has to be something that's definitely for public purpose. And typically the town might get a preservation restriction on that asset. The bottom right is the Abigail Adams house. This is privately owned by the Abigail Adams Society. It's her birth home. That building was in such bad shape, there was graffiti covering the entire front, and now it really looks terrific. It's open to the public as a museum. Anyone ever been to Northampton? Right on the main drag there, you see that fantastic Academy of Music building. It's really the hub of downtown, and CPA paid to restore that entire historic facade. And I love the project in the top left with the ivy. That's from Westfield. Westfield is known as the Whip City because at one time they had 11 whip factories there, and this is the last remaining one. These are horse and buggy whips I'm talking about. And they're converting that museum, that historic building, into a museum of the Whip City history. So CPA helped do some exterior rehab work there. Documents and artifacts were not part of the original CPA legislation. There have been about 11 amendments that we've worked on for CPA, and this was one in 2006, and now you can rehabilitate and preserve historic documents and artifacts with CPA funding. So moving on to the open space and recreation category. Playgrounds are a huge CPA asset that has been fixed up starting in 2012 when we changed the legislation there. And athletic fields, same thing, whether it's constructing new ones, buying land for new parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields, or fixing up the ones you already have. Rail trails are incredibly popular now. And we haven't had too much land purchased for rail trails because it's often leased land from the railroad. But we certainly have had construction spending on rail trails for CPA projects all over the state. I love these little pocket parks and different example of CPA funding. You know, we have skateboard parks, splash parks. The latest craze is pickleball. I'm sure you're hearing about it. We've had pickleball courts built with CPA money lately. Little pocket parks, like in Barnstable, there was a kind of an alleyway between two main streets, and they built this beautiful little pathway and pocket park to connect those two. And the top right project is in Weymouth. That's the Herring River. And it ran behind this dilapidated garage. No one even knew the river was there. And they used CPA money to tear down the garage. And then they use CPA money to build this park. And they do the annual herring run count, where they count the herring as they're coming back up the river in the spring by standing right by that blue railing there. And that's where they do the count. In urban areas, particularly community gardens are a great source of CPA funding. And now let's turn to the affordable housing category. So one of the benefits of CPA is most affordable housing programs only will fund things that are for residents up to 80% of the area-wide median income. CPA can go to 100%, which is called moderate income. And these are the actual income levels for Shrewsbury. So you can pay to build housing in Shrewsbury that can be occupied by people earning up to those income limits. You will only get credit for it with the state on your housing inventory if you go up to 80%, but there's a real need for what they call workforce housing or moderate income housing. And you can do that with CPA up to 100% of area-wide median income. We've had a lot of specialty housing built with CPA funds, like housing for veterans and adapting other buildings. This is kind of the trifecta that, the double thing that Jason was talking about, taking a historic building and converting it into housing, two different CPA categories, like they did in the top right. That's the Ames Shovel Shop in Easton. Around the turn of the century, virtually every shovel used in the world was made in that factory, the Ames shovel. The brand is still around. If you go to Home Depot, you'll see Ames shovels. And now it's a great, beautiful housing complex with both affordable and market rate units. That's another shot of the shoe shop factory. And bottom left in North Andover, they took an old closed nursing home and turned that into affordable housing. This is a terrific project that was done in Lexington and replicated in Rockport, where a nonprofit called Supportive Living Incorporated did a rehab of a beautiful historic building, and now it's home to folks who have traumatic brain injuries. There's 9 units in that historic print shop in Lexington. You probably have a Habitat for Humanity chapter out near you. I would definitely have them come talk to you. CPA has partnered with Habitat all over the state, probably in 60 or 70 different communities, to build really cost-effective, affordable housing. So that's the full presentation, and we did it on time. We urge you to spend some time on our website, and we sent a copy of this presentation already to Rowan, who can distribute it to you folks. And give us a call if you have any questions. Chase and I are here to help you. We're replacing our third staff person coming in January. We had someone leave right before the pandemic, and we've been all working from home, so haven't wanted to bring anyone on board, but now we're going to be heading back to the office, we think, in the new year, and we'll bring on our third hire for an associate director's position to provide some more capacity to help you guys out. So we are here for you and happy to answer your questions now, if there are any left, and in the future.
Stuart, thank you very much. Rowan, is there anybody on the line? Since I can't see, anybody have a question? Anybody have their hand raised?
I do not see anyone on the line, but you're welcome to raise your hand and we can call on you.
You can also send questions to me or Rowan after the fact. If you think of a question in a day or two and you want it answered or would like it answered, you can send it to me and Rowan, and we'll do our best to, we can either reach out to Stuart for you or what have you and get an answer. Rowan, I'm sorry. I think Rowan, you wanted to talk about the vote, I believe, for the next meeting.
Right. No, well, I just wanted to just to close out with Stuart. So, Stuart, thank you very much for your time tonight, and I really appreciate it. Always talking with you.
All right.
Like-
Thank you. It was nice to meet you all, and good luck. We'll be here to help you out.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Have a good rest of the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bernie, I
All right,
believe
on
we
to-
can just continue through our agenda.
Yes.
Yep. So next item is up for discussion is the minutes from October 4th. And they were sent out a few weeks back and were made available to make any edits. So at this point, are there any questions or comments relative to the minutes from October 4th? Again, if someone has raised their hand, just please say something, come off mute and just say something. Because I cannot see the screens on phone only.
I don't see any
Okay.
hands, Jason.
All right, thank you. Hearing none, could I get a motion to accept the meeting minutes from October 4th as presented in the Google Drive for our committee?
So moved. This is Rajesh.
Do I have a second?
Second. It's
Is that
Deborah.
Deb?
Yep.
Thank you. All right, good. Thank you very much. All right, I will go through a roll call to accept those minutes. Rajesh,
Yes.
Deborah,
Yes.
Melanie,
Yes.
Martha,
I'm sorry, I dropped. What are we voting on?
these are the minutes from October 4th as presented in our Google Drive.
Are we voting to accept them?
Yes.
Okay, then yes.
Gail, Gail, are you still with us? I'll circle back. Steve?
Yes.
Thank you. Jim?
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
Okay, and do we have Gail now? Does anybody see Gail on screen?
No.
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 Okay,
We can mark her as absent in the vote.
thank you. Awesome.
Internet is
All right.
crapping down.
All right. So next is next meeting time and date. I think there's a lot of content from tonight, but I certainly wouldn't want to lose momentum and just absorbing what we've heard tonight, plus documents already existing in our Google Drive discussed last time. So I'd like to see us, if possible, meet in 1 month's time, perhaps the 29th. That's really 4 weeks out. Or if we want to do 5 weeks out on this December 6th, Monday at 7 p.m. Just my personal feeling, and if there's anybody in person, and if anybody else has questions or comments to that, or want to forward, or have a different opinion.
Jason, I'd like to request the 29th, as I'm going to be traveling on the 6th.
Me too.
Jason, this is Rowan McAllister. We do have a zoning board of appeals meeting scheduled for 6:30 on November 29th. I will also have to attend that meeting, and the selectmen's room will not be available at that time. If so, a couple of our options, if that is a date we need to do, it probably would likely have to be another remote meeting unless any other staff on the line knows of a different meeting place.
So the Conservation Commission did meet in the town library last month.
I think since we're going to go forward with Rowan as the primary staff on the CPC, I think it'd be best if she could be there. I don't know how late into December this CPC wants to go. CPC members want to go, Jason. I know obviously the closer to the holiday, the more challenging it gets. There is, I know Steve said he'd be away the 6th. Oh,
I'm away also, and the Patriots are playing, which is where I'm going.
oh, very nice. Very nice.
I'm away this Friday.
Is the 13th, would that be an issue for anyone, the 13th?
That's fine with me.
That's good.
I could do that.
So Jason, I'll hand it over to you, Jason.
Yeah, that's fine. Is there anybody have a conflict at all for the 13th? Okay. Hearing none, that sounds like the common time. Just also though, I do want to ask you, Bernie, that when do we normally start seeing the cycle start for the budget cycle? Because I know that the preliminaries are reviewing the documentation and getting things prepared for the feedback into the mill.
I didn't quite hear you at the beginning there, Jason.
Sure. When does the budget cycle typically work? I know Stu was talking about that in general terms, but where does it happen in Shrewsbury? Is it December time? Is it January?
The budget cycle. We're running our fiscal year runs to July 1st to June 30th.
So what I mean is the preparation for the next fiscal year, any of that
yes, sorry. No, that begins Sorry. No, that begins now. Yeah, that begins in December. We start to submit our draft budgets to the town manager's office for review. I know Kristen's actually still on the line. I know she can speak probably to greater details for all departments and how the town handles budgets all around.
Yeah, so the town manager has issued the budget cycle. The call for budgets is actually coming out December 1st, with I believe budgets due the end of December or beginning of January. I will have Rowan send out the budget calendar to you all so you have it, but I think we have some time, and seeing that we're going to have a pretty bare bones budget for fiscal 23, I think that it will be a lighter lift than in future years. So I can map that out with Rowan and Bernie, and we can get the CPC committee a memo related to that budget timeline in advance of the next meeting.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And so as we heard also from Stuart, that it's pretty much going to be baked for us, right? Because just moving the monies into those 10% accounts on the balance going into the reserve. So, all right. So if there's no issue with the timeline, then it sounds like December 13th is our date. Could I have a motion for December 13th, 7 p.m. in the Selectmen Room?
I move that our next meeting be held December 13th at, did you say 6 p.m. or 7 p.m.?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. in the Selectmen's meeting room.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Oh, wait, who was that? Who seconded?
Steve.
I couldn't see. Steve? Okay, Steve.
Okay, thank you. All right. Going to
Jason,
Yeah.
this is Martha. Gail is on the line, but she can't unmute. But she's listening.
If you push *6, she might have luck unmuting. *6.
Gail with us? All right, we'll cycle back. Okay, going on to a roll call vote on the motion for next meeting. Rajesh?
Yes.
Deb?
Yes.
Melanie?
Yes.
Martha?
Yes,
Gail?
she's typing.
We'll come back. Steve?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
And we have a response from Gail online?
Not yet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we do have a majority of vote here. Do we have to wait for Gail, or can we?
We can mark in the minutes that technical difficulties occurred. I think that's fine. We can move on.
Okay, thank you. All right, moving on to other business. There is no business that I'd like to raise at this time. Does anybody have any business that they'd like to address at this moment? Okay, hearing none. I do want to give an opportunity for Gail if she, can anybody see Gail? And I want to make sure that I'm not closing it out if she has something that she wants to bring up.
She said that she lost the entire connection.
Yeah, I looked at my router as well and kind of we're down here, so it could be parts of, with outage. Okay. All right, then I think with that being said, we'll need to adjourn if there's a motion for that.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All right, on to roll call. Rajesh?
Yes.
Deb? I didn't hear that. Sorry. Deb?
Yes. Sorry, technical difficulties. Yes.
Thank you. Melanie?
Yes.
Martha?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
All right, last call for Gail.
Gail is out.
Okay, myself, yes. That's a wrap. Thank you all.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thanks
Gail.
so much.
Bye now.
Bye.